It is 6:42, September 21st, 2018 as I write this, and it's just been announced that hundreds were let go at the once iconic Telltale games. None of those now jobless developers were given severance or even a warning. Only 25 souls are left at the studio, a skeleton crew to fulfill the company's obligations to its board and its partners, according to a statement given to Kotaku. Telltale is about to shut down. They might finish The Walking Dead Season 4, but they probably won't. It seems they're even trying to pass development on to somebody else, anybody else. It's a sad ending, to say the least. Telltale's made so many great games over the years that it's hard to believe in a few weeks, maybe a couple of months at best, Telltale will be no more. But given the torrent of bad news that's come out of the studio in the last couple of years and the mediocre reception of their games lately, maybe this news shouldn't be so surprising. Telltale Games started in June 2004, co-founded by Kevin Bruner, Dan Connors, and Troy Melander. The three were former designers at LucasArts. Embittered by the company's then shift towards wall-to-wall Star Wars games, they wanted to go back to their roots of point-and-click adventure games. But in 2004, video game development was expensive, more so than it is now. There weren't tools in place like Unity or Unreal Engine 4, or marketplaces like Steam Early Access, Itch.io, or even Kickstarter to help get things started. Because of that, the indie scene wasn't nearly as big or as popular back then as it is today. Worst of all for them was that it seemed like nobody really wanted to play adventure games anymore. Telltale got around this in three ways. First, they would team up with big media companies to work on pre-existing licensed IPs to base their games on. This would allow the studio to remain independent, but also ensure a steady stream of cash from their partners, while allowing them and whatever name they stuck on the game to do the marketing for them. Second, they would revolutionize the way video games were released. Video games up until Telltale came around had always been released as finished products. They might have some form of primitive DLC or expansion packs or bug fixes and updates or whatever qualifier you want to make. But for the most part, when you purchased a game, you got the whole game, right then and there. Not so with the majority of Telltale games. They would come to introduce the television-inspired episodic gaming, a new way of releasing games in usually 2-hour chunks over the course of several months. The reason for this is simple. It allows players to opt in to a full season of around 3 to 8 episodes at a low price, usually $3 to $5 per episode, for the first episode to see if they like it before buying the whole season ahead of time in a season pass. The problem soon became that Telltale was taking far too long to make episodes. The gap between some would sometimes balloon between 3 to 4 months, a massive length of time for episodes that could easily be completed in one sitting. But the benefit of releasing games in episodes is obvious. You get to release a part of your game and start making money on it right away, allowing you a steady stream of income to help you finish the rest of it. This was basically early access before early access, and as we see now with the final season of The Walking Dead, it's just as risky. Third, Telltale sought to change the way adventure games were played. Rather than focusing on puzzle solving, they would instead emphasize story and player influence over that story. At the time, not many studios were focusing so much on narrative, much less player choice in those stories. Telltale was kind of a pioneer in that regard, letting the player make dialogue choices that would guide the story and influence how the characters felt about you. At least, that's how it seemed for the time. In Telltale games, the player never really changes the story. It was more about making you feel like you were part of it. While this was fine at first, as gaming evolved over the years to include more player choice, more dialogue options, more actual influence over stories, Telltale stayed rigidly fixed in their old ways. Their illusion of choice eventually began feeling more restrictive than freeing. It would be slow going for Telltale for a long time. Between 2005 and 2012, the company released 19 games, slowly building a niche for themselves as the last point-and-click adventure studio, releasing solid, if not spectacular titles. Among the highlights are Bone Out from Boneville, their first adventure game, 3 Sam & Max titles, and Tales from Monkey Island, released in conjunction with LucasArts, Back to the Future, and Jurassic Park the Game, arguably their first real failure up until that point. During this time, Telltale also created their own development engine, the Telltale tool. Game engines are often blamed far too often for problems that aren't really related to gaming. It's not Bethesda's game engine that makes their games buggy as hell, it's bad programming and the lack of time and interest in fixing them. But in the case of the Telltale tool, the company's much maligned weapon of mass destruction, the negativity is somewhat warranted. The engine was very limited in what it could do, so most of the gameplay in Telltale games consisted of walking from one conversation to the next, with the occasional button-mashing QTE just for variety. Their games were also incredibly buggy, which only seemed to get worse over the years. What also spawned from this engine, though, was Telltale's patented rigidity. When someone says a Telltale game, you immediately know what they're talking about. No matter what IP they're working with, no matter what the story is, they're all the same from a gameplay standpoint. Cel-shaded, point-and-click adventure games, heavy on dialogue and story, light on traditional gameplay yet chock full of QTEs, and dialogue options that they say will massively influence the story going forward, but they never actually do. This method of mass-producing, factory-standardized video games would go on to play a huge role in dooming the company, I think. But for all their flaws, none of them mattered on April 24th, 2012. Episode 1 of Telltale's The Walking Dead was like a nuclear bomb. The TV show's second season ramped up the previous month, and it was awful, but the show was still a massive hit at the time. The property and zombies were hot, and everyone wanted a piece. Naturally, anything based on the show, based on the comic, would be popular, but Telltale's take wasn't just a cash-in, it was something special. Written by Sean Vanneman and directed by he and Jake Rodkin, Episode 1 announced Telltale as one of the best narrative studios in the industry. The Walking Dead saw you take on the role of Lee Everett, still to this day one of the most nuanced, best-written and acted characters in gaming history. Season 1 of Telltale's The Walking Dead is one of the most emotional, heartfelt, and heartbreaking experiences in gaming, and it was a revelation at the time. In 2012, generic modern military shooters ruled the day. Good storytelling without the for a video game qualifier was rare, and indie gaming hadn't yet experienced its boom in popularity or accessibility. Then, all of a sudden, this little independent adventure game studio that not many people have heard of releases a great narrative-driven game based on zombies of all things that went on to win several Game of the Year awards from the likes of USA Today, Wired, Complex, and more. What am I saying here? I'm saying that the rise in storytelling video games lately and the explosion of indie gaming is, at least indirectly, thanks in large part to Telltale. I have no actual hard evidence for that, of course, but it sounds good, right? Telltale was suddenly a household name, at least as much as a household name as a video game developer could be, but right away, things were heading south. Sean Vanneman and Jake Rodkin, the directors and lead designers of The Walking Dead and several other Telltale games, suddenly left the studio after The Walking Dead's success to form their own company, Campo Santo. At the time, it didn't seem too out of the ordinary. These two super successful developers wanted to create their own games by themselves. Who doesn't want that? But the truth about their departure would be much more dramatic than that, one we wouldn't find out about until recently.
It feels like you kind of enjoy it when things go wrong, because it gives you an excuse to stop pretending.
Telltale's success would seemingly continue for years afterward, with The Wolf Among Us based on the cult hit comic Fables, The Walking Dead Season 2, which was a step down from the previous season but was still well received, Tales from the Borderlands, an excellent take on Gearbox's overhyped franchise that's still the best game in the series, Game of Thrones, which I have nothing interesting or witty to say about, and Minecraft Story Mode, which remains the most shocking video game announcement ever made. But behind the scenes, things were falling apart ever since the success of the first season of The Walking Dead. Tales from the Borderlands, which is for my money Telltale's best game, sold so poorly that higher-ups within the company wanted to cancel it. The game was only finished because co-director Nick Herman convinced executives to relocate most of the development staff to other projects, as much as 95% according to Herman, leaving only a skeleton crew to finish the remaining 2 episodes. That's just crazy considering Tales from the Borderlands is the company's second highest scoring game on Metacritic, and was in serious contention for several Game of the Year awards that year. As you'd expect, expect, the truth about Tales' sales didn't come until after the series was finished and Herman left the studio in September 2017. What's really key here, though, is the timing of him coming forward with this. About half a year later, in March 2018, another nuclear bomb would go off, only this time, the bad kind. I mean the metaphorically bad kind. Well, they're all bad, but I mean like a metaphoric nuclear bomb that is bad, not the good metaphoric kind like The Walking Dead was. That month, Megan Farouk-Manesh, probably mispronounced that, reporting for The Verge, dropped a bombshell story detailing a near Konami-level toxic workplace environment. And we're not just talking about somebody microwaving fish in the break room. The article is long and exhaustive in detailing everything that's gone on behind the scenes at Telltale since their first season of The Walking Dead. Before that, the studio was a relatively small one of less than 100 people. Former developers described the studio as a tight-knit group, but that changed after the success of their Zombie Sadness simulator and their subsequent popularity and dearth of projects. The studio quickly grew to over 300 people, and worst of all, management started playing a more prominent role in day-to-day operations, taking on more projects without feedback from their staff and even influencing design decisions. Telltale became a tribal environment, with a lot of the older staff not communicating with the new hires. Very rarely, people were writing things down on a wiki or Confluence page or any sort of documentation, a former employee stated in the article. People were shifting so often that you would hear a version of a story that was actually weeks old, and the person telling you has no idea because that's the last thing they heard. Worst of all, though, was the crunch. It's a term you might have heard a lot of lately as video game developers fight to try and unionize for better working conditions and pay. One of the top priorities for these developers is the death, or at least minimization, of crunch time. Telltale apparently had it worse than many studios, burning through countless writers and narrative designers in particular with each and every project. Some employees had 6-day work weeks, working as long as 14 to 18 hours a day. A big part of that, according to the article, was time management, or lack thereof. The pace at which the studio operated was both an amazing feat and its biggest problem, says the former employee. Executives would often ask teams to rewrite, redesign, recast, and reanimate up until the very last minute without properly adjusting the schedule. The demands on the production only become more intense with each successful release. At some point, you just don't have anything left to give. The article pretty much states that one person is to blame for all of this: co-founder and former CEO Kevin Bruner. We're venturing into gossip territory here, but several employees say that Bruner, who helped create the Telltale tool that has since gotten so much flack, felt he deserved credit for The Walking Dead success, not Vanneman or Rodkin, and that desire of his to take the spotlight, which he had done by accepting interviews on their behalf, was what forced them to leave the studio. After that, he became more inflexible, greedy, and petty, pushing his team to higher and higher heights, forcing those long hours and continuing to take credit. It's alleged he tightened his grip even more after the success of Vanneman and Rodkin's game Firewatch and of Night School Studio, another company founded by former Telltale devs and their game Oxenfree, in some kind of desperate attempt to keep more of his team from jumping ship. But things got really bad when Bruner took over as CEO when Dan Connors stepped down. That's when Telltale employees started describing Bruner as the Eye of Sauron from Lord of Rings for how he insisted on controlling and overseeing every little detail at the studio. 2 paragraphs from this article are quite damning of Bruner's management style. Former employees and sources with direct knowledge of Telltale's inner workings consistently describe Bruner as a creative bottleneck who micromanaged every part of the development process, from pitch to final product, even going so far as to personally rewrite tutorial text. He wanted to have been consulted on everything from the color of the walls to who they've hired to write specific dialogue, a former employee says. And later in the article, executive review meetings with higher-ups like Bruner became infamous within the company as brutal, hours-long arguments where Bruner would belittle and question the choices of those involved with the studio's projects, according to half a dozen sources. When Bruner saw something he decided he didn't like, which was very often and was exactly what he asked for, that was really undeserved, and often really difficult for teams to deal with, the source says. Since this article was published, one thing has been consistently made clear. Telltale games didn't die a few few weeks ago. They died when The Walking Dead became a huge success. For example, in February 2015, 1 month after Brunner took over as CEO, Lionsgate heavily invested in Telltale, announcing they signed a partnership with the developer to co-create the company's first new IP. The details were vague, being described as some kind of video game and TV show hybrid, but nothing ever came of the partnership. Nothing good, anyway. What did allegedly come from it was Lionsgate pressuring Telltale's board of directors, which at one point included former EA CEO John Riccitiello, because he's such a beloved figure, into firing Brunner. How can that be a bad thing, you ask, after hearing how Brunner puts Riccitiello to shame? Well, because Brunner did eventually step down in March 2017, which led to him suing the company, saying he was forced out, and that the company didn't properly help him in selling off his shares, and that wasn't properly told about the poor financial state of the company. Brunner would then be replaced by Pete Howley, former executive at Zynga, you know, the mobile games company that runs Farmville and shoves microtransactions in all its games. 2 months after taking over, Hawley immediately laid off 25% of his staff, saying to VentureBeat that he chose to do that instead of cancel some of their in-development games, meaning that not only did he choose those games over his staff, he also ensured that the remaining staff would have to fill the void left by that 25%, which was reportedly 90 people, meaning that the already overworked developers had to work even harder now. But what were some of the games Telltale had in its pipeline during this time? Well, that's the part we all know about. I last mentioned Tales from the Borderlands, its first episode released in November 2014. Because of the behind-the-scenes drama with the game, its final episode wouldn't see the light of day until October 2015. But don't worry, they also released Game of Thrones, Minecraft Story Mode, The Walking Dead Michonne, Batman, The Walking Dead Season 3, Guardians of the Galaxy, Minecraft Story Mode Season 2, Batman Season 2, and The Walking Dead Season 4, all released between 2015 and 2018. That's 9 games in about 3.5 years, and that's not even everything. They were still working on that Lionsgate game, The Wolf Among Us Season 2, Game of Thrones Season 2, a Stranger Things game, and even another new IP that would have been a complete departure from the studio. Some kind of procedurally generated open-world zombie game not related to The Walking Dead. That's just way too much. But everyone's saying that's too many games in too short a time frame. That's far from an original or even interesting statement, so let's look at it this way. By and large, those games were almost all decently received. They didn't blow anyone's socks off, but they weren't terrible. To put that vague nonsense I just muttered into some kind of perspective, Game of Thrones averaged a 69 on Metacritic. Nice. The Walking Dead Season 3 a 73, Batman Season 2 an 80, Guardians of the Galaxy a 78, you get the idea. So it's not like these games were poorly received or badly made or anything, and with such massive names attached to them as Batman, Minecraft, and Guardians of the Galaxy, you'd think they'd have done relatively well from a sales standpoint, and maybe they have, we don't really know their sales figures. Also keep in mind the financial contributions from Lionsgate and all the other partners they worked with here, Marvel, Warner Brothers, Netflix, etc. So you have a company that is or was allegedly abusing its staff by making them work 14 to 18 hours a day, 6 days a week, a game engine that you steadfastly refuse to change, upgrade, or improve after a decade of use, licensing agreements from a bunch of massive companies who are paying said company to make games, a lot of games coming out on a consistent basis that somehow got good review scores despite the constant staff turnover and a hostile workplace environment, and they had big marquee franchises attached to them. Yet despite all of that, everything there I just listed, they're going out of business anyway, not paying any of their employees severance, and are now getting sued because of it. How is that even possible?
The list of things that might kill us keeps getting longer. Racks, skags, bandits, dehydration, heat stroke, regular stroke, stroke. I've never felt so alive!
Not being a former employee myself, and without anyone answering my emails, I can only speculate based on the information that's freely available online, and a little guesswork. Firstly, while they did indeed make too many games, I don't think that's the disease, that's the symptom. What caused them to make that many games and take on a staff of over 300 and then nearly work that staff to death was the belief by management that Telltale could be a huge, massive AAA company that appealed to a wide audience, and that was just never going to happen. Adventure games were never, or at least haven't been for nearly 2 decades, a mass audience mainstream type of genre. Because of Telltale's either fear of changing or their inability to change due to lack of funds, they never once really updated how their games are played. They never really innovated. They were all made with the same outdated engine, featuring the same outdated gameplay mechanics and the same outdated graphics. The only thing that kept them relevant was their writing, and like we established, they were burning through writers like popcorn. Adventure games just aren't that popular anymore. The Walking Dead Season 1 was a fluke, a 1 in a million shot. The only adventure game in recent memory that's also been successful was Life is Strange, and that had the backing of Square Enix and a massive ad campaign behind it. Plus, they at least tried something different with the time travel mechanics. This is backed up by true trophies. Telltale games all give out trophies or achievements for playing and completing their episodes, so it's fairly easy to look at the trophy data for the first episodes of all their series and get a rough idea of how many people are playing these games. Specifically, how many players have played through at least the first chapter of the first episode in each series, according to the article. The numbers aren't flattering. Over 289,000 people bought The Walking Dead Season 1, and the numbers drop sharply from there. 135,000 for The Wolf Among Us, 123,000 for The Walking Dead Season 2, 104,000 for Tales from the Borderlands, which, remember, sold so poorly that Telltale wanted to cancel it. That really puts the rest of these games' dwindling numbers in perspective. Now, there are caveats, of course. This is far from a scientific study. It only tracks players across PlayStation and Xbox consoles. It doesn't take into account players who bought these games on multiple platforms, nor the people who bought them but still haven't got around to playing them yet. Still, seeing such a sharp and consistent decline in the number of people buying and playing these games gives you a good idea of how unpopular adventure games are. When you look at the success of Telltale's The Walking Dead, you have to ask yourself a sobering question. Was it as successful as it was because it was great, or because The Walking Dead was such a cultural phenomenon at the time that it was bound to succeed regardless, and it being great was just icing on the cake? I think the latter is sadly true. It's as Clickist founder and editor-in-chief Greg Michek put it to me the other day. To me, The Walking Dead made sense. Even though I'm sure the Borderlands stuff they did was amazing, I don't know how many hardcore shooter dudes into Borderlands thought, you know what, I love shooting shit in Borderlands. I'm dying to play a game on the opposite end of the gameplay spectrum. And he's right. Look at it this way. I don't like raisins, but I love David Hayter. Just because you put David Hayter's face on a box of raisins doesn't mean I'm going to buy them. I might buy one box as a collector's item, but that doesn't mean I'm going to keep buying them over and over again. Another thing you have to consider is the episodic nature of these games. Episodes were extremely short. Many could be beaten in less than 2 hours, easily one sitting for most of us. Telltale took so long to make these episodes that by the time the next one was done, you'd completely forgotten everything that happened in the last one because you beat it so quickly. Plus, it meant that individual episodes had to sometimes compete with massive releases of the time. Imagine if The Walking Dead Season 4 Episode 2 were released at the same time as Spider-Man, or Assassin's Creed Odyssey, or Red Dead Redemption 2. It'd be a death sentence not just for that episode, but for the entire series, because no one would buy later episodes since they didn't get around to the second one. We can't really place the blame entirely on Kevin Bruner here either. A lot can and should be blamed on him if those reports are true, but you have to remember he's gotta fall in line with the board of directors. That board includes a bunch of venture capitalists from places like Granite Ventures and IDG Ventures, who donated $6 million to the company way back in 2007. These are the kind of companies that specialize in essentially taking over businesses from the inside to maximize profit and then leave the moment things get tough. Then there was Lionsgate and of course Riccatello. It was no longer about making a quality game necessarily, and more about satisfying those investors first and foremost. With Telltale's unique approach of securing other people's IP to work with, I bet those investors insisted they only go after the biggest and flashiest names in entertainment. If Telltale somehow stayed afloat, I wouldn't be surprised if they eventually got around to a Fortnite game. And then, of course, Telltale made very little effort to course correct. They knew they were selling fewer and fewer games with each series, yet they continued operating as they always had, churning out series after series after series, making every game look and play the same when they had to know it wasn't working anymore. Holly laying off 90 people might have been them trying to fix things, but they didn't try very hard, and remember, they chose to lay off those people rather than give up any of their numerous projects. There's no one reason why Telltale failed. It was a whole bunch of stuff that just snowballed over time, but you can certainly trace the beginning of the end to a very specific point in time. It's ironic that the company's greatest success would also lead to its downfall, but that's where greed and overambition often leads. Perhaps if the company stuck true to its niche origins instead of trying to become the next big thing, it could have been different. They might still be making a tidy little profit for themselves for years to come, or maybe they might have shut down ages ago. Personally, it took quite a few days for the news of Telltale's closure to really hit me, you know? It only just happened as I'm wrapping this script up, as a matter of fact. I mean, I can kind of feel the tears welling up now. Telltale meant a lot to me. I spent a lot of time in this video criticizing their formulaic games, but it was a formula that worked for a long time. They made a lot of games that I still love. The Walking Dead, The Wolf Among Us, Tales from the Borderlands, and I've been meaning to try their take on Batman and Sam Max for a while now. Shit, it breaks my heart knowing Tales from the Borderlands will forever end on a cliffhanger. Not that we were ever going to get a sequel anyway, given how poorly the series sold, but still. It's petty to be thinking about video games right now. I'll be the first to admit that when a game studio or any place that employs a bunch of people shuts down, I don't really care. I mean, it sucks for the people who lost their job, but it doesn't really affect me. Sure, I'll say my condolences, but that's more to be in on the morning, isn't it? You know, to be part of something big. Maybe I'm doing that again, but this time it feels different. It really hurts this time. Knowing a lot of great, well, I don't know if they're great people. Statistically, some of them are probably assholes. But knowing that people who brought us a lot of great games are now out of jobs because those in charge refuse to learn from history is just... It's annoying, but it's also just sad. Greed and ambition is just a one-way ticket to hell, and everyone on board had to pay for it. I don't know what to say anymore. So, here's to you, Telltale. Here's to you.